They traded 3 million acres for a single building, a deal so massive it created the XIT Ranch and redrew the map of Texas. In 1885, as the ashes of the state capital still smoldered, Chicago bankers and British investors struck the most audacious land for construction swap in American history, snatching up a territory larger than Connecticut. Critics called it folly. Who would bet millions on empty prairie? Yet from disaster, the world's largest cattle empire was born, powered by foreign money and a vision few believed possible. But how did a scorched-out state and a group of speculators engineer the rise and looming fall of the XIT Ranch? The answer starts the moment Texas went up in flames. November 9th, 1881. Flames gutted the Texas state capitol in Austin, reducing its dome and grand halls to blackened rubble. Smoke drifted over the city for days as lawmakers and citizens stared at the charred skeleton, an unmistakable sign of crisis for a state already short on cash. The legislature, land-rich but strapped for funds, faced a dilemma: how to replace the seat of government without a cent to spare. The solution would become legend. 3 million acres of remote Panhandle prairie, an expanse nearly the size of Connecticut, were set aside as payment for the new capital. No cash changed hands. The state would trade land for a building, wagering its future on the value of territory most Texans had never seen. The urgency grew as temporary quarters filled with the noise of government business and public frustration. Lawmakers debated materials, designs, and costs, determined to build a capital that would outshine any in the country. Their ambitions soared: a dome taller than the U.S. Capitol, halls clad in Texas limestone, and a footprint that would dwarf any rival. Yet the only asset at their disposal was the Panhandle, an ancient grassland stretching 200 miles north to south, home to the Querecho and Tejas before the land rush, now seen by many as empty, wind-blown desert. The legislature's offer drew skepticism and scorn. Who would want 3 million acres of what critics called barren wilderness? The answer came from far beyond Texas. In Chicago, the Farwell brothers, Charles B. and John V., saw opportunity where others saw only risk. Their background was in dry goods and real estate, not ranching, but they understood the potential of untamed land and the power of scale. With partners Amos C. Babcock and Abner Taylor, they formed the Capital Syndicate, striking a deal that would change the face of Texas. The terms: build the new state house in Austin and receive title to the entire Panhandle block. By 1882, the Capital Syndicate held the contract. Colonel Amos Babcock rode out from Fort Elliott, his party covering 950 miles in 36 days to inspect the boundaries. Surveyors marked the tract, a strip running nearly the full length of the Panhandle, 20 to 30 miles wide, touching 10 counties: Dallam, Hartley, Oldham, Deaf-Smith, Parmer, Castro, Bailey, Lamb, Cochrane, and Hockley. The land was mapped, its value fixed by statute. Payment would be made not in dollars, but in deeds. Construction of the new capital began with high drama. The original plan called for Texas limestone, but the stone stained quickly with rust. Granite from Marble Falls, donated by local business partners, became the solution, and a 2.3-mile railroad spur was built to haul the massive blocks. 86 Scottish granite cutters shaped the stone, while hundreds of convicts and laborers raised the walls. The project's final cost topped $3.7 million, with the syndicate covering $3.2 million of that sum. On April 21st, 1888, the Texas state capitol opened to the public, its dome gleaming above the city, built not with tax money, but with the promise of distant grass. The land transfer was finalized. The Farwell brothers and their partners now owned a kingdom, more than 3 million acres, deeded in exchange for a single building. The deal set in motion a new kind of empire, one that would stretch the limits of imagination and business alike. Communities soon sprang up at the edges of the grant: Channing, Texline, Bovina, and 2 towns named Farwell. The Panhandle, once dismissed as wasteland, was about to become the stage for the world's largest cattle operation. The stakes were set. Texas had bartered its future for stone and steel, and the next move belonged to the men willing to bet everything on grass. John V. Farwell stepped onto the London docks in 1884 with a singular mission: raise the money needed to turn 3 million acres of Texas prairie into a working cattle empire. The Capital Syndicate's land deal had handed the Farwell brothers and their partners a kingdom, but their Chicago fortunes alone couldn't cover the scale of what lay ahead. Cattle, fencing, windmills, payroll, every detail demanded capital far beyond what American banks would risk on a Texas gamble. Farwell understood where to find it. London's financial world was hungry for American opportunity. Stories of Texas grasslands and booming beef markets filled the pages of British investment journals. Farwell wasted no time. He drew up a prospectus and began a whirlwind tour of the city, pitching the XIT vision not just as a ranch, but as a land and cattle operation that could rival any in the world. The Capital Freehold Land and Investment Company Limited was born, incorporated in London with a board stacked with titled names. The Earl of Aberdeen and Henry Seton Carr, a member of Parliament, joined as directors. The company's prospectus called for £10 million, an astonishing sum even by Gilded Age standards. British investors lined up for a piece of the American West. Farwell offered 5% debentures, a safe bet for cautious capital, and 7% bonds for those willing to wager on higher returns. The syndicate's Texas land, stretching across 10 counties, became collateral for this transatlantic venture. Promoters in London painted the Panhandle as the next great agricultural frontier, and the investment houses took notice. Within months, Farwell had raised $10 million, enough to fund the entire operation and then some. The syndicate's British partners now held the purse strings, expecting regular interest payments and a return on their investment. The money arrived before the first steer grazed XIT grass. British pounds paid for herds of longhorns, thousands of miles of barbed wire, and the hiring of hundreds of cowboys. Every mile of fence, every windmill tower, every shipment of supplies bore the invisible stamp of London finance. The Farwell's Chicago syndicate still called the shots, but the real power flowed from the counting rooms of Threadneedle Street. The bond contracts set a ticking clock. The debentures matured in 5, 10, and 15 years, each tranche a reminder that the ranch's future was now tied to the fortunes of men who had never seen a Texas sunrise. As the first cattle arrived and the fences climbed skyward, the syndicate's books showed a new reality. The world's largest ranch was, at its core, a British-backed experiment in American scale. The XIT would live or die not just by the weather or the cattle market, but by the expectations of distant investors who saw the Panhandle as a line item in their global portfolios. Farwell's gamble paid off, for now. The money machine in London had transformed a Texas land deal into a fully funded cattle empire, years before the first profits ever reached Chicago. The future of the XIT would depend on whether those British bonds could be paid and whether the grass of the Panhandle would yield enough beef to satisfy the appetite of both London bankers and the American frontier. Fence gangs arrived on the Panhandle with nothing but wagon loads of wire and the promise of a paycheck. Their orders were simple: enclose 3 million acres, no matter how long it took or how far it stretched. The first shipment, 5 boxcars of Brinkerhoff ribbon wire and 2 of staples and hinges, rolled west from Fort Dodge, Kansas. Every mile meant unloading, hauling, and pounding posts into ground so hard it bent iron spades. Surveyors like W.S. Mabry marked the lines, sometimes with dirt mounds when wooden stakes ran out. The longest stretch ran unbroken for 150 miles, a feat that made cowboys joke you could ride 3 days and never find a gate. As the perimeter closed, a second wave of work began. Cross fences sliced the XIT into 94 pastures, each one a world of its own. By the late 1890s, the ranch counted more than 1,500 miles of interior fencing. Patrol crews, 5 in all, rode the lines, checking for breaks, mending wire, and clearing drifted snow in winter. Every year, thousands of dollars went to repairs, and every spring brought new stories of blizzards twisting posts or panicked steers tearing through a mile of wire in the night. Water was the next challenge. The Panhandle's grass was thick, but rain was scarce and natural springs were few. The answer came in wind and steel. By 1900, the XIT had planted 335 windmills across the range, each one drilled down to water at an average of 125 feet. The most ambitious stood at Yellow Houses, a windmill rising 132 feet from the canyon floor, taller than most church steeples, its wheels spinning above the prairie like a beacon. 14 men worked full-time as windmill hands, hauling pipe, greasing gears, and fishing broken rods from the wells. Some windmills pumped day and night for weeks. Others froze solid and had to be chipped loose at dawn. Every fence, every windmill, every mile of pipeline was built by anonymous hands. Crews whose names rarely made the ledgers, but whose sweat turned empty land into working ranch. Their labor made it possible for a single foreman to manage a division the size of a county, for a cowboy to find water after a day's ride, and for thousands of cattle to graze where only buffalo had wandered before. The work was never truly finished. Fence lines drifted under snow, posts rotted, and windmills wore out their bearings. But the system held. It was the hidden grid that made the XIT possible. A lattice of steel and sweat stretched across the wildest corner of Texas, maintained by men who measured their days in wire spliced and wells repaired. Without them, the world's biggest ranch would have been nothing but a line on a map. Ab Blocker stepped into the Buffalo Springs corral with a problem on his mind and dust swirling at his boots. The Panhandle was thick with cattle thieves, and every rancher knew the game. Brands could be twisted, curves turned into letters, circles made into stars. Blocker, a trail driver with a knack for outsmarting outlaws, needed a mark that would fight back. He dropped to a knee and drew 3 letters in the dirt, XIT, each one a straight line, each one impossible to curve or bend with a running iron. Beside him, ranch manager BH at Barbecue Campbell watched, knowing that the right brand could mean the difference between holding on to a herd and losing a year's profit to the shadows. The XIT brand was simple: 5 straight bars, each burned in with a red-hot iron. No curves, no loops, nothing a rustler could easily disguise. In theory, it was unbreakable. Cowboys across the divisions learned to burn it deep into the hide, following Blocker's exact pattern. The design turned up in the official Texas brand book, registered to John V. and Charles B. Farwell, a legal shield as much as a warning to would-be thieves. But out on the open range, law and paper meant little when a clever outlaw had a running iron and a long night ahead. Cattle rustlers in the Panhandle were inventive, always looking for a way to beat the system. The running iron, a straight heated rod, let them draw freehand, turning a simple mark into something new. They'd take a curved brand and add a line here or a bar there, transforming circles into letters, letters into shapes. The XIT with its blocky letters was supposed to stop that, but the thieves studied it, watched the patrols, and found their opening. One night, a rustler traced the XIT on a stolen steer and, with a few quick strokes, turned it into a star. The X and T became points, the I cross at the center. In the morning, it looked like a completely different brand, a trick so clean that even experienced hands had to look twice. Word of the altered brands traveled fast. Cowboys found themselves squinting at hides, looking for telltale scars where the iron had been run a second time. Some could spot the difference by the way the hair grew back, others by the faint outline of the original mark beneath the star. The best hands claimed they could tell which division a steer came from by the angle of the burn, but for every thief caught, another seemed to slip through, driving rebranded cattle across county lines or selling them at distant markets where no one asked questions. The battle between Blocker's brand and the outlaws became a test of wits and nerve. Ranch patrols rode the fence lines, eyes peeled for fresh tracks or cattle moving where they shouldn't. When a rustler was finally caught with a running iron and a branded hide, the story spread through the bunkhouses like wildfire. Some say XIT men paid a captured thief to show exactly how he'd altered the brand, using his own iron to demonstrate the trick in the dirt. It became a lesson for every hand on the ranch. No mark was unbreakable, no system foolproof, and the only real defense was vigilance. For Blocker and Campbell, the XIT brand was more than a symbol. It was a line in the sand, a challenge to every thief who thought he could outsmart the world's largest ranch. Each time a steer was branded, each time a patrol caught a rustler in the act, the message was clear. This land, these cattle belonged to XIT, and they weren't going to give them up without a fight. Dawn broke over the prairie, and the XIT drive was already in motion. 10,000 head of longhorns stretched in a restless line, hooves stirring dust that drifted for miles on the wind. For 60 days, this was a city on the move, cowboys, wranglers, and a rolling kitchen trailing behind the herd. The chuck wagon, piloted by a cook like Cato or his trusted hand, was the heartbeat of the drive. Before sunrise, coffee boiled and biscuits baked in Dutch ovens, while bacon sizzled in cast iron. Cowboys drifted in for a quick meal, their plates filled with beans, beef, and sourdough before riding out again. Each man had a job, and every job mattered. The wranglers kept track of a remuda of 100 horses, swapping out mounts 3 times a day to keep fresh legs under every rider. Trail boss Cato rode point, scanning for trouble. River crossings, loose cattle, or signs of Comanche or Kiowa along the horizon. Flanking the herd, seasoned hands like Tom Gist or Bob Fudge kept the line moving, whistling and singing to calm nervous steers. At the rear, the drag riders worked in a haze of dust, coaxing stragglers forward, their faces streaked with mud and sweat. Supplies were rationed with care. The wagon carried flour, salt pork, coffee, dried fruit, beans, and slabs of salt beef, enough to feed 20 men for weeks, but nothing wasted. Water barrels were lashed tight, refilled at every creek and river, but sometimes the only drink was from muddy buffalo wallows. Each cowboy packed a bedroll, slicker, and a battered hat to shield against the sun. Nights brought a different rhythm. The herd bedded down in a circle, guarded by 2-man watches. Coyotes called from the dark, and lightning on the horizon meant every man slept with boots on, ready for a midnight stampede. The pace was relentless, 12 to 15 miles a day, every day, rain or shine. At daybreak, the cook's triangle bell rang out, and the herd was moving again before the sun cleared the horizon. The drive's order was strict. A lost steer or a lame horse could cost hours, and every delay threatened the schedule. The men learned to live with blisters, grit in their teeth, and the ache of endless hours in the saddle. But there was pride too. Moving a herd this size was a test of grit and skill, a feat few could claim. For 60 days, the XIT drive was a world unto itself, part hardship, part adventure, and always a measure of the men who made it possible. A river crossing could turn deadly in minutes. On the Cimarron, the herd bunched tight at the water's edge, their hooves churning up quicksand with every nervous step. Trail boss O.C. Cato watched as the lead steers plunged forward, only to bog down halfway across, legs sucked under by the invisible current. Cowboys yelled and cracked whips, desperate to keep the herd moving, but a few animals panicked, spinning in the shallows, and soon the whole mass started to mill. In the chaos, 20 head vanished, swallowed whole by the riverbed before anyone could throw a rope. The Cimarron claimed horses too. 5 drowned that day, their bodies pulled from the sand hours later. The survivors limped out on the far bank, shaking and wild-eyed, while the crew counted losses and patched up wounds. Stampedes came without warning. A lightning flash on the open prairie, a sudden clap of thunder, and 2,000 longhorns could bolt in the dark. One night on the Montana Trail, the herd broke loose just after midnight. Cowboys scrambled for their mounts, racing to circle the leaders and turn the wave of cattle before it tore through the camp. Bedrolls and coffee pots scattered beneath pounding hooves. In the confusion, a cook's wagon was overturned and a wrangler thrown. By dawn, the herd was scattered across miles of grassland. It took 2 days to round them up. 3 steers were found dead in a ravine, trampled in the stampede. The wrangler, bruised but alive, counted himself lucky. Floods hit with equal force. Snake Creek, usually a trickle, swelled to a roaring torrent after a week of rain. The herd was caught mid-crossing with cattle swept downstream in the muddy water. Cowboys plunged in, roping calves and dragging them to higher ground. 4 men nearly drowned before the last steer was hauled out. The official tally, 40 head loss, dozens more limping for days. The trail boss noted the losses in his ledger, a grim reminder that nature took its share, no matter how well the drive was run. Each disaster forced the crew to adapt. After the Cimarron crossing, Cato ordered tighter formation and more scouts upriver. Following the Snake Creek flood, the men built makeshift rafts for gear and led the herd across in smaller groups. When stampedes hit, they sang to the cattle at night, voices carrying over the prairie to keep the herd calm. Every emergency meant lost sleep, ruined supplies, and hard choices: push on or turn back and face the investor's wrath. Some years, the trail ate up profits before the herd ever reached Montana. Yet the drives continued, each one a gamble against weather, water, and the wildness of cattle. For every disaster survived, the respect for the men and the risks grew deeper. The scale of XIT meant no setback was small. Every mile tested the limits of endurance, and every loss proved just how thin the line was between fortune and ruin. B.H. Barbecue Campbell arrived at the XYT with a reputation for discipline and a knack for order. A manager who insisted on rules, routine, and respect for the chain of command. The ranch's code was strict, written out in 22 rules tacked to bunkhouse walls across 3 million acres. No drinking, no gambling, no firearms, no killing beef without permission. Cowboys who broke the code were sent down the trail before sunset. No exceptions. Campbell's word was law, and for a time, the ranch ran with military precision. But behind the facade of order, cracks began to show. Campbell's management style bred resentment among the hands. He rode hard on small offenses, yet rumors spread that the biggest violations started at the top. Whispers in the bunkhouses told of cattle contracts with his cousin MC Campbell, deals that brought sickly or underweight animals onto XYT grass at inflated prices. The cousins' herds arrived with suspicious frequency, and each time, the ranch's books showed a new expense that didn't match the quality of the stock. Auditors from Chicago and London began digging through ledgers. Their reports raised questions about missing cattle and curious payments. Some entries pointed to a steady trickle of kickbacks, money flowing from the ranch's coffers to Campbell's own family. The more they looked, the more patterns emerged. Cattle counted twice, contracts awarded without bids, and shipments that never matched what was promised. Cowboys noticed, too. While they faced instant dismissal for sneaking a drink or playing cards, they watched as Campbell's inner circle seemed untouchable. The rules that kept the bunkhouse in line didn't seem to reach the manager's office. Discontent grew, and a few brave hands, men who had worked the range for years, sent word to the board. Their letters described not just the fraud, but the hypocrisy of a man who enforced discipline with one hand while breaking trust with the other. In 1887, the board acted. Campbell was called to account in a meeting that ended his tenure. The charges were clear: favoritism, fraudulent contracts, and a pattern of self-dealing that threatened the entire operation. He left the ranch with his reputation in tatters, but not before pocketing profits that would bankroll new ventures in Kansas. The XYT's strict order had masked a deeper instability, one that nearly cost the syndicate its investment and left the ranch vulnerable at its core. The fallout ran deep. Auditors tightened controls, new managers were brought in, and the board demanded transparency from every division. The rules stayed on the wall, but now there was a new code. Trust had to be earned, not just enforced. The scandal exposed the limits of authority and the dangers of unchecked power, setting the ranch on a path toward greater scrutiny, and for a time, restoring faith that even the largest empire could hold its leaders accountable. January 1918 delivered the kind of winter that Panhandle ranchers always feared, but by then the XIT was no longer a single empire. The last cattle had shipped out in 1912, closing the books on an operation that had once run 150,000 head across 3 million acres. What followed was a slow, methodical drawdown, land by land, ledger by ledger, until the world's largest ranch became a patchwork of new beginnings. The decision to break up the XIT was neither sudden nor sentimental. Years of hard lessons, drought, blizzard, market collapse had left their mark. The blizzard of 1886 to 1887 had killed thousands across the plains, and even the best managed herds lost 15% of calves in a single bad winter. Cattle prices never fully recovered, and British bondholders holding $10 million in London debentures grew restless. The bond clock ticked louder each year, with tranches maturing in 5, 10, and 15-year intervals. Cash flow from cattle sales could not keep pace with interest payments, and the board in Chicago faced mounting pressure to turn land into liquidity. The first big sale set the tone. In 1901, George W. Littlefield, an Austin banker with a nose for opportunity, wrote a check for 235,858 acres out of the Yellow Houses division, $2 an acre cash. William E. Halsell matched him soon after, paying the same rate for 184,155 acres from Spring Lake. John M. Shelton took over the Ojo Bravo range, and Lee Bivens bought 70,000 acres near Channing, including the old XIT headquarters. Each deed was a chapter closing, each new ranch a sign that the era of the cattle barons was giving way to a new order. The syndicate's land office, run by F.W. Wilsey, shifted into high gear. Parcels were carved into 160 square mile blocks, with demonstration farms, poor farms as cowboys called them, planted near Channing and Palmerton to lure settlers. By 1905, 800,000 acres were on the market, and the trust known as Capital Reservation Lands took over the final sales. The numbers told the story. Over 1.5 million acres sold at $2 an acre, with 95% of buyers becoming actual settlers, not speculators. The old division boundaries faded as new fences and plows reshaped the landscape. Railroads, once the ranch's lifeline, became agents of change. The Fort Worth and Denver and Pecos Valley lines brought buyers from as far as Illinois and Kansas, and every carload of cattle or wheat meant another check to redeem British bonds. Freight contracts with the Santa Fe and others, long a source of negotiation and occasional rebate, faded in importance as the business shifted from moving steers to moving families and seed. The last of the British bonds were paid off by 1909, and the English investors who had once bankrolled the world's largest cattle operation left with their principal and interest, if not the wild profits as they had imagined. The final years brought new faces and new ambitions. By 1929, only 450,000 acres remained under XIT ownership, and by 1963, the last tract had been sold. The Great Blizzard of 1918, which killed hundreds of cattle across the Panhandle, struck land that had already passed into new hands. The era of single-operator empires had ended, replaced by a mosaic of ranches and farms, each with its own story of risk and reward. Yet the XIT's legacy remained visible in every windmill, every line of fence, every courthouse deed. The drawdown of the giant was not a collapse, but a transformation, one measured not in lost fortunes, but in the spread of new communities and the enduring myth of a ranch that once stretched farther than the eye could see. At its peak, the XIT Ranch spanned 3 million acres, an area larger than Connecticut, fenced by 6,000 miles of barbed wire and managed by more than 150 cowboys. Original contracts like the 1882 agreement between Texas and the Capital Syndicate and British debenture records prove this was no myth, but a calculated business gamble backed by international capital. The ranch's downfall, documented in November 1912 sale records and weather logs from the deadly blizzards, reveals how financial pressures and nature ultimately forced its breakup. Yet, many original correspondence files remain sealed, leaving questions about internal decision-making and personal motives unanswered. Today, annual reunions in Dalhart and ongoing ranch operations on former XIT land show its legacy still shapes Texas. The evidence is clear. The XIT Ranch wasn't just a cattle empire, it was a turning point, proving that vision, capital, and relentless labor could transform a remote frontier into a cornerstone of modern Texas.